Long before Solomon ever sat upon the throne of Israel, before his name became synonymous with wisdom itself, there was a promise whispered in the darkness of a palace bedroom. King David, the man after God's own heart, the shepherd who slew giants and conquered kingdoms, lay beside Bathsheba and made a declaration that would change the course of history. This child, this boy not yet born to inherit the throne by traditional rights, would be king. Not the oldest son, not the strongest warrior, but Solomon, whose very name means peace. The ancient world operated by rigid rules of succession. Firstborn sons inherited kingdoms, wealth, and power. Yet God's patterns throughout Scripture consistently shatter human expectations. Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau, Joseph elevated above his older brothers, and now Solomon, born from a union that began in scandal and tragedy, chosen to rule the greatest kingdom Israel would ever know. The prophet Nathan delivered God's message directly to David, confirming what the aging king already felt in his heart. This son would build the temple David had dreamed of constructing, the permanent dwelling place for the Ark of the Covenant. But succession in ancient monarchies was never simple, never clean, never without bloodshed. David's household had become a viper's nest of competing ambitions, jealous brothers, and political factions. His son Amnon had been murdered by Absalom. Absalom himself died in rebellion against his father, caught by his famous hair in an oak tree and killed by Joab's spears. The palace walls had witnessed unspeakable violence, betrayal between brothers, and the collapse of family bonds under the weight of unchecked power. Into this chaos, Solomon was born, protected by his mother's fierce love and his father's divine promise. Bathsheba understood something that many of David's other wives did not. Power in ancient Israel was not just inherited, but fought for, schemed for, and defended with every tool available. She had entered David's life through tragedy, a woman bathing on her rooftop who caught a king's eye. David's desire for her led to adultery, deceit, and ultimately the murder of her husband Uriah, one of David's most loyal warriors. The prophet Nathan had confronted David with a parable that exposed his sin, and the consequences were severe. The first child born from their union died despite David's desperate fasting and prayers, yet God's grace emerged from that darkness. Solomon was born, and the prophet Nathan gave him a second name, Jedediah, meaning beloved of the Lord. This was no ordinary prince. While his older brothers trained in warfare and political maneuvering, Solomon was being prepared for something different. The biblical text remains relatively quiet about his childhood, but we can piece together a picture from the wisdom he would later display. He studied the natural world with an intensity that would later allow him to speak authoritatively about plants from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop growing in walls. He observed human nature, watching the constant parade of petitioners, officials, and foreign dignitaries who passed through David's court. As David aged, his grip on the throne weakened. The text of 1 Kings paints a picture of a once mighty king, now old and cold, unable to get warm even when covered with blankets. His servants brought him a young virgin named Abishag to lie beside him and provide warmth, but David did not know her intimately. This physical decline signaled to the ambitious that the throne was soon to be vacant, and in that vacuum, power-hungry men saw opportunity. Adonijah, David's son through Haggith, decided he would be king. He was older than Solomon, handsome, and had never been disciplined by his father. The text specifically notes that David had never interfered with him by asking why he did anything. This lack of parental correction had produced a man who believed himself entitled to whatever he desired. Adonijah gathered supporters, including Joab, the longtime commander of David's army, and Abiathar the priest. He held a great feast at the stone of Zoheleth near En-Rogel, sacrificing sheep, cattle, and fattened calves. He invited all his brothers except Solomon and all the royal officials of Judah, except those loyal to David's chosen successor. This was more than a celebration. This was a coronation ceremony, a public declaration of kingship designed to present the nation with a fait accompli, Once Adonijah was proclaimed king before witnesses, with priests and military commanders supporting him, it would be extremely difficult to reverse. Civil war would likely result if David tried to enforce his choice of Solomon. Blood would flow in Jerusalem's streets as competing factions fought for control. But Adonijah had miscalculated. He had forgotten the determination of a mother protecting her son and the prophet who spoke with God's authority. Nathan the prophet went to Bathsheba with urgent news and a strategic plan. He instructed her to go immediately to King David and remind him of his oath that Solomon would reign after him. Nathan would follow and confirm her words, creating undeniable testimony before the king. Bathsheba hurried to David's chamber, where the aged king lay with Abishag attending him. She bowed low, and David asked what she desired. Her words were carefully chosen, respectful yet urgent. She reminded David of his sworn oath that Solomon would sit on his throne after him. She informed him that Adonijah had declared himself king without David's knowledge, sacrificing great numbers of animals and inviting all the king's sons except Solomon, along with Abiathar the priest and Joab the commander. She concluded with the critical question that would echo through the chamber and force David to act. All Israel was watching to see who David would name as his successor, and if he did nothing, when he died, both she and Solomon would be treated as criminals by King Adonijah. Before David could respond, Nathan the prophet was announced and entered the chamber. He confirmed everything Bathsheba had said and added more details, emphasizing the political and religious support Adonijah had gathered. Nathan's final question was pointed and direct. Had David authorized this? Had the king decided to change his succession plan without informing his closest advisors? The implication was clear. If David had not authorized it, then Adonijah was committing treason, attempting to steal the throne from the rightful heir. David's response was immediate and decisive. He called for Bathsheba to return and made a solemn declaration, swearing by the Lord who had delivered him from every trouble. Solomon would be king that very day, just as David had promised. The aged king then issued rapid commands that set in motion a coronation ceremony designed to overwhelm Adonijah's attempted coup. Solomon was to ride on David's own mule, a symbolic act that represented the transfer of royal authority. He would be taken to Gihon, where Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet would anoint him king over Israel. Then trumpets would sound and all the people would shout that King Solomon lived. The plan was executed with precision. Solomon, who had been preparing his entire life for this moment without perhaps fully realizing it, was placed on his father's mule. The procession moved through Jerusalem accompanied by Zadok carrying the horn of oil from the sacred tent and Nathan the prophet. At Gihon, before witnesses and with proper religious authority, Zadok anointed Solomon's head with oil. The trumpets blasted and the people erupted in celebration so loud that the ground shook with the sound. Meanwhile, Adonijah and his guests were finishing their feast when they heard the noise. Joab, the experienced military commander, recognized the sound of trumpets and asked what the uproar meant. Before anyone could answer, Jonathan, son of Abiathar, arrived with news. His first words must have felt like a death sentence to Adonijah. "Our Lord King David has made Solomon king." Jonathan described the entire ceremony in detail, including the fact that David's royal officials had come to congratulate the old king, and David had bowed in worship on his bed, blessing the Lord for allowing him to see his successor established. Terror seized Adonijah's guests. They scattered, each man fleeing for his life, abandoning the would-be king in his moment of greatest need. Adonijah himself, understanding that he had committed treason and that Solomon now held the power of life and death over him, ran to the sacred tent and grabbed hold of the horns of the altar. This was an ancient rite of sanctuary, a desperate claim for mercy. He sent word that he would not leave the altar until King Solomon swore not to execute him. Solomon's response revealed the wisdom that was already developing within him, even before God's supernatural gift. He declared that if Adonijah proved himself worthy, not a hair of his head would fall to the ground, but if wickedness was found in him, he would die. Subscribe to uncover how this young king's wisdom would soon be tested in ways that would amaze the entire ancient world. What happens next reveals the supernatural encounter that transformed Solomon from a cautious new ruler into the wisest man who ever lived. Chapter 2. A kingdom inherited, a burden accepted. Solomon's first days as king of Israel were unlike the glorious visions poets might imagine. He was young, likely in his late teens or early 20s, suddenly responsible for governing a nation that stretched from the Euphrates River to the border of Egypt. The kingdom David had built through decades of warfare and political maneuvering now rested on untested shoulders. Ancient texts suggest Solomon was acutely aware of his inexperience, feeling the weight of expectations pressing down like the massive stones that would later form the temple walls. King David, though he had officially transferred power, was not yet dead. He used his final days to give Solomon instructions that mixed spiritual wisdom with brutal political reality. The biblical text preserves David's deathbed speech, and it reveals a complex understanding of kingship that went far beyond idealistic notions of justice and mercy. David first charged Solomon to be strong, to show himself a man, and to keep the requirements of the Lord. If Solomon walked in God's ways and kept his statutes, commands, ordinances, and testimonies as written in the law of Moses, he would prosper in everything, and God would keep the promise that David's line would always rule Israel. But then David's instructions took a darker turn, revealing that even righteous kings must sometimes have blood on their hands to maintain stability. David spoke of Joab, the longtime commander who had served David faithfully in many battles but had also murdered 2 men, Abner and Amasa, in times of peace, shedding blood as if in battle. David instructed Solomon to deal with Joab according to wisdom, not letting him go down to the grave in peace. This was essentially a death warrant, delayed justice for crimes David himself had never punished because he needed Joab's military expertise and political support. David also mentioned Shimei, a man from Saul's clan who had cursed David viciously when David fled from Absalom. Though David had sworn not to kill Shimei, he now told Solomon that Solomon was not bound by that oath. David advised Solomon to use his wisdom to bring Shimei's grey head down to the grave in blood. These instructions reveal an uncomfortable truth about ancient monarchy. Mercy and justice constantly warred with political necessity. Leaving dangerous enemies alive was not compassion but foolishness that could destabilize the entire kingdom. Then David died and was buried in the city of David, having reigned 40 years over Israel, 7 years in Hebron and 33 in Jerusalem. Solomon sat on his father's throne and his kingdom was firmly established, but that establishment would require eliminating the threats David had identified. The new king's first major test came when Adonijah made a request that seemed innocent but carried deadly implications. Adonijah approached Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, and asked her to speak to Solomon on his behalf. He wanted to marry Abishag, the young virgin who had attended David in his final days. Bathsheba agreed to present the request, apparently not seeing the danger. She went to King Solomon, who stood to greet her, bowed down to her, and had a throne brought for her at his right hand. This gesture of respect toward his mother was culturally appropriate and demonstrated Solomon's character. But it was also politically significant. The Queen Mother held considerable power in ancient Near Eastern kingdoms, serving as an advisor and advocate. When Bathsheba presented Adonijah's request, Solomon's response was immediate and harsh. Solomon recognized what his mother had not. In ancient royal courts, marrying the former king's wife or concubine was a claim to the throne. When Absalom rebelled against David, one of his first acts was to sleep with David's concubines in public view, a symbolic declaration that he had replaced his father. Adonijah's request to marry Abishag was not about romance but about legitimacy. If Adonijah married the woman who had been in David's bed, he could argue that he had inherited at least part of David's royal status. Solomon saw through the request immediately and responded with anger. Why ask only for Abishag? Why not ask for the kingdom itself? Solomon swore an oath that very day. May God deal with him severely if Adonijah had not spoken this request at the cost of his life. Solomon declared that God had established him on his father's throne and founded a dynasty as promised, and on that very day, Adonijah would be put to death. He sent Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, who struck Adonijah down, and he died. The first threat to Solomon's rule was eliminated, and the young king had demonstrated that he would not tolerate challenges to his authority, even from his own family. Next, Solomon addressed Abiathar the priest, who had supported Adonijah's attempted coup. Solomon told him to go back to his fields in Anathoth, noting that Abiathar deserved to die, but that Solomon would not kill him at this time because he had carried the ark of the Lord before David and had shared in David's hardships. Solomon removed Abiathar from the priesthood, fulfilling the word the Lord had spoken at Shiloh about the house of Eli. This was a reference to a prophecy given generations earlier that Eli's priestly line would be cut off. Abiathar was a descendant of Eli, and his removal from office fulfilled ancient prophecy. When news reached Joab that Adonijah had been killed and Abiathar removed, Joab realized he was next. This veteran warrior, who had commanded David's armies for decades and survived countless battles, fled to the tent of the Lord and grabbed hold of the horns of the altar, just as Adonijah had done. When Solomon was told that Joab had fled to the altar, he sent Benaiah to strike him down. But Benaiah found Joab clinging to the altar, refusing to leave, declaring he would die there. Benaiah returned to Solomon with this report, and Solomon made a decision that reveals his understanding of both law and political necessity. Solomon ordered Benaiah to do as Joab asked: strike him down and bury him, removing from Solomon and his father's house the guilt of the innocent blood Joab had shed. The Lord would repay Joab for the blood he shed when he attacked and killed Abner and Amasa, both men more righteous and better than Joab, without David's knowledge. So Benaiah went back to the altar and struck Joab down, killing him there, and he was buried at his home in the wilderness. This execution at the altar might seem to violate the principle of sanctuary, but under Mosaic law, premeditated murderers were not entitled to asylum. Joab's crimes disqualified him from protection. Solomon then appointed Benaiah to command the army in Joab's place and installed Zadok as priest in place of Abiathar. These were younger men loyal to Solomon personally, without competing loyalties to other members of David's family. Finally, Solomon dealt with Shimei, the man who had cursed David. Solomon summoned him and gave him specific instructions. Build yourself a house in Jerusalem and live there, but do not go anywhere else. The day you leave and cross the Kidron Valley, you will die, and your blood will be on your own head. Shimei agreed to these terms, accepting what was essentially house arrest in the capital where Solomon could monitor him. For 3 years, Shimei kept his word and stayed in Jerusalem, but then 2 of his slaves ran away to Achish, king of Gath, and when Shimei heard where they were, he saddled his donkey and went to Gath to search for them. He found his slaves and brought them back, apparently thinking that the king's prohibition only applied to going into Israelite territory, not to foreign lands. But someone reported to Solomon that Shimei had left Jerusalem and gone to Gath and returned. Solomon summoned Shimei and reminded him of the oath and the explicit warning. Why had Shimei not kept his oath to the Lord and obeyed the command? Solomon then spoke words that revealed his understanding of justice and the delayed consequences of sin. He told Shimei that he knew in his heart all the wrong he had done to David, and now the Lord would repay Shimei for his wickedness. But Solomon himself would be blessed, and David's throne would remain secure before the Lord forever. Then Solomon gave the order to Benaiah, who went out and struck Shimei down, and he died. The threats to Solomon's throne had been systematically eliminated, and the kingdom was now firmly in his hands. The young king had proven himself capable of the ruthless decisions monarchy sometimes required. But Solomon was not content with political security alone. Deep within him burned a hunger for something more than power, something more than wealth or military might. He wanted wisdom, true understanding, the ability to judge righteously and lead his people in ways that would honor the God who had chosen his family to rule Israel. What happened next would transform him from a capable young king into a legendary figure whose wisdom would be discussed and debated for thousands of years. If this journey through Solomon's life is revealing biblical truths you never knew, hit that like button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. Chapter 3: The Dream That Changed Everything. Solomon demonstrated his devotion to God in the early months of his reign by offering sacrifices at the high places, since the temple had not yet been built. The text specifically mentions that he offered 1,000 burnt offerings at Gibeon, the most important high place, where the tabernacle that Moses had made in the wilderness was located. This was an extraordinary sacrifice, showing both Solomon's wealth and his desire to honor God properly. 1,000 animals represented a significant portion of the kingdom's resources, but Solomon considered no gift too great for the Lord who had established him on his father's throne. That night, after the sacrifices had been offered and the smoke had risen to heaven, something remarkable happened. The Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at Gibeon, and God spoke words that would change the course of human history. "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." This was not a vague spiritual impression or a symbolic vision requiring interpretation. God spoke directly, offering Solomon anything he desired without limitation. Think about the magnitude of that offer. The creator of the universe, the God who held all power, knowledge, and resources, invited a young man to name his request. What would you ask for if given unlimited choice? Most people, if honest, would request wealth, long life, health for themselves and their families, victory over enemies, fame, pleasure, or power. These are the things human hearts naturally crave, the desires that drive most of our daily decisions and long-term planning. Solomon could have asked for any of these things and received them immediately. He could have requested that Israel become the wealthiest nation on earth, that he live for centuries, that all his enemies be destroyed, that his fame spread to every corner of the known world. But Solomon's response revealed something profound about his character and his understanding of his role. He began not with his request, but with acknowledgement and humility. He reminded God of the great kindness shown to David, his father, because David had been faithful, righteous, and upright in heart. He acknowledged that God had continued this great kindness by giving David a son to sit on his throne that very day. Then Solomon made a statement that seems almost shocking for a king, an admission of weakness that no monarch would normally make publicly. He told God that he was like a little child who did not know how to carry out his duties. This was not false humility or religious rhetoric. Solomon genuinely felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of governing the nation God had chosen as his own people. He described them as too numerous to count or number, emphasizing the impossible burden of judging and leading such a vast population. Then came Solomon's request, the words that would define his legacy and establish him as the wisest human who ever lived. "Give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong." The Hebrew word translated as discerning literally means hearing or listening. Solomon asked for a heart that could hear, that could perceive truth beyond surface appearances, that could understand the complex realities of human nature and divine justice. He did not ask for knowledge in the abstract, but for practical wisdom to fulfill his specific calling as king and judge over God's people. The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this. The text emphasizes God's pleasure, noting that because Solomon had not asked for long life or wealth or the death of his enemies, but for discernment in administering justice, God would grant his request. But God's generosity exceeded even what Solomon asked. Not only would Solomon receive a wise and discerning heart unlike anyone before or after him, but God would also give him what he had not requested. Riches and honor would be his beyond any other king of his time. And if Solomon walked in God's ways and obeyed his decrees and commands as David his father had done, God would also give him long life. Then Solomon awoke, and he realized it had been a dream, but not an ordinary dream. This was the kind of divine encounter that marked pivotal moments in biblical history, similar to Jacob's dream of the ladder reaching to heaven or Joseph's prophetic dreams in Egypt. Solomon returned to Jerusalem and stood before the Ark of the Lord's covenant, where he sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings and gave a feast for all his court. The dream had transformed him, and soon everyone would see evidence of the gift God had bestowed. But what exactly did this gift mean? What is wisdom in the biblical sense, and how does it differ from mere intelligence or knowledge? The Hebrew word for wisdom, chokmah, encompasses far more than intellectual capacity. It includes skill, expertise, sound judgment, moral insight, and the ability to apply knowledge effectively to real situations. A person could memorize every law and precedent, but still lack the wisdom to judge a difficult case justly. Wisdom sees past deception, understands human motivation, recognizes consequences before they occur, and applies principles in ways that bring about the best outcomes. Solomon's wisdom would manifest in multiple ways throughout his reign. He would become renowned for his ability to judge legal disputes, as we will see in the next chapter. He would demonstrate understanding of the natural world, speaking about plants and animals with expertise that amazed scholars from other nations. He would compose thousands of proverbs and songs, capturing timeless truths about human nature, morality, relationships, and the fear of the Lord that is the beginning of wisdom. His administrative abilities would organize the kingdom with unprecedented efficiency. His architectural vision would produce buildings that became wonders of the ancient world. But wisdom also came with awareness of complexities that others might miss. Solomon would see not just the surface of situations, but the layers beneath, the competing motivations, the long-term consequences, the moral ambiguities that make judgment difficult. This kind of vision could be a heavy burden, as Solomon himself would later write in Ecclesiastes. With much wisdom comes much sorrow, and the more knowledge, the more grief. Understanding human nature deeply meant seeing human weakness, selfishness, and foolishness more clearly than those who lived in comfortable ignorance. Some scholars debate whether the wisdom God gave Solomon was purely natural, an enhancement of his existing mental capacities, or whether it included supernatural knowledge, direct divine revelation in specific situations. The text suggests both elements were present. Solomon's general understanding of how to govern, judge, and lead was enhanced to superhuman levels, but there also seemed to be moments, particularly in famous judgment cases, where Solomon received specific insights that could only come from divine revelation, knowledge of hidden facts that no amount of natural wisdom could discern. The timing of this gift was also significant. God did not wait until Solomon had proven himself through years of successful rule. The dream at Gibeon occurred early in his reign, when he was still establishing his authority and learning how to govern. This suggests that God responds to the humble recognition of our inadequacy more than to confident demonstrations of competence. Solomon received wisdom not as a reward for achievement, but as a gift to enable him to fulfill the calling God had placed on his life. This pattern appears throughout Scripture. Moses protested that he was not eloquent and could not speak well, yet God called him to confront Pharaoh. Gideon was threshing wheat in a wine press, hiding from enemies, when the angel called him a mighty warrior. Jeremiah objected that he was only a child, too young for the prophetic calling. Mary questioned how she could bear a child since she was a virgin. In each case, God provided what was needed to accomplish what he commanded. Solomon's wisdom was supernatural provision for a supernatural responsibility. Comment below if you've ever faced a responsibility that seemed far beyond your abilities and had to trust God for wisdom you didn't possess. That moment of recognizing our insufficiency is often the beginning of receiving divine provision. But the question that haunted Solomon throughout his life was whether the gift of wisdom guaranteed he would always use it correctly, or whether even the wisest man could make foolish choices that would destroy everything he had built. Chapter 4. Wisdom's first test. News of Solomon's divine gift spread quickly through Jerusalem, but the true test of his wisdom came in a case so difficult that it seemed impossible to judge justly. The text of 1 Kings chapter 3 preserves one of the most famous legal judgments in human history, a case that has been studied in law schools, referenced in countless court proceedings, and analyzed by philosophers for its brilliant psychological insight. the details are stark and disturbing, involving 2 women, 2 babies, and one unspeakable tragedy. 2 prostitutes came to King Solomon and stood before him. The fact that they were prostitutes is significant, as it tells us they were among the most marginalized members of society, women with no husbands to speak for them, no family connections to give them influence, and no social standing that would command respect. In most ancient courts, such women would have been dismissed or their case given minimal attention. But Solomon's court operated differently, and the text emphasizes that he gave audience to all his subjects regardless of their social status. One of the women began to tell her story. She explained that she and the other woman lived in the same house, and that she had given birth to a baby while they were alone there. 3 days later, the other woman also gave birth. There was no one else with them in the house, just the 2 of them and their newborn sons. Then came the tragedy. During the night, the other woman's baby died because she lay on him, accidentally smothering him in her sleep. This was a known danger in ancient times when mothers and infants often slept together for warmth and nursing, and infant mortality from such accidents was tragically common. But what happened next transformed a tragic accident into a crime. The first woman claimed that during the night, while she was asleep, the other woman had gotten up, taken her living son from her side, and placed her dead son there instead. In the morning, when she woke to nurse her son, he was dead. But when she looked at him closely in the daylight, she realized it was not her baby at all. The woman was claiming that her housemate had deliberately switched the babies, stealing the living child and leaving the dead one. The second woman immediately denied this, shouting her contradiction before the court. "The dead baby is yours and the living one is mine." The first woman shot back, "No, the living one is mine and the dead one is yours." They argued back and forth before the king, each woman absolutely certain in her claim, each presenting the same basic facts but with opposite interpretations. This was the kind of case that could not be decided by examining physical evidence or calling witnesses, since no one else had been present. It was one woman's word against another's, with no clear way to determine who was telling the truth. The court officials and advisors standing around Solomon must have wondered how he would handle this impossible situation. The conventional approach would be to declare the case undecidable and perhaps divide any property or resources between the 2 claimants equally, satisfying neither but at least appearing fair. Or Solomon could have tried to determine which woman seemed more credible based on their demeanor, essentially guessing who was lying. Neither approach would have been satisfactory, and neither would have produced justice for the true mother. But Solomon, guided by the supernatural wisdom God had given him, took an approach so shocking that it made everyone in the room gasp. He called for a sword to be brought to him. When a servant presented the blade, Solomon issued a command that seemed brutal and insane. "Cut the living child in 2 and give half to one woman and half to the other." There was a moment of stunned silence in the court. Was the wise king seriously proposing to kill an innocent baby? Had he gone mad? The advisors must have looked at each other in confusion and horror. But Solomon was not mad. He was testing the women in a way that would reveal the truth with absolute certainty. He understood something profound about human nature and specifically about maternal love. A true mother would sacrifice anything, including her own claim and rights, to protect her child's life. An imposter, on the other hand, would be willing to see the child die rather than let the other woman win. Solomon had created a situation that would force each woman to reveal her true heart. The response was immediate and exactly what Solomon had anticipated. The woman whose son was alive was filled with compassion for her son and cried out to the king, "Please, my lord, give her the living baby. Don't kill him." But the other woman said, "Neither I nor you shall have him. Cut him in 2. In that moment, the truth became blindingly obvious to everyone in the courtroom. The first woman was willing to lose her child to save his life. The second woman was willing to see him killed rather than let the first woman have him. Only a true mother would make the sacrifice the first woman offered. Only someone driven by jealousy and spite would demand the child's death. Solomon immediately gave his final judgment. Give the living baby to the first woman. Do not kill him. She is his mother. The wisdom of the solution was elegant and devastating. Without any investigation, without witnesses or evidence, Solomon had revealed the truth by creating a test that forced each woman to expose her deepest motivations. The true mother's love could not bear to see her child harmed, even if it meant losing him. The false claimant's jealousy preferred destruction to defeat. When all Israel heard the verdict the king had given, they held the king in awe because they saw that he had wisdom from God to administer justice. This case became famous throughout the kingdom and beyond its borders. It demonstrated that Solomon possessed not just knowledge or intelligence, but true wisdom, the ability to see into human hearts and bring forth truth even in situations that seemed impossible to judge. The story spread to neighboring kingdoms, and Solomon's reputation as a wise judge began to grow. But this famous judgment raises deeper questions that have intrigued scholars and philosophers for millennia. Was Solomon's solution a genuine willingness to kill the child, or was it a bluff he knew would never be carried out? Did he have supernatural knowledge from God about which woman was the true mother? Or was he using psychological insight to create a test that would reveal the truth? Could this approach work in other cases, or was it specifically designed for this unique situation? The text does not answer these questions explicitly, leaving room for interpretation. What seems clear is that Solomon understood the powerful instinct of maternal love and knew it would override self-interest in a true mother. He also understood that jealousy and spite could lead someone to prefer mutual destruction over seeing a rival succeed. His solution was not a formula to be applied mechanically to every case, but a creative response to specific circumstances, which is the essence of wisdom as opposed to mere rule following. Some modern readers are troubled by Solomon's apparent willingness to kill an innocent child, even as a test. They argue that a truly just would never suggest such a thing, that the ends do not justify the means, and that threatening infanticide is wrong regardless of the outcome. This criticism raises important questions about the nature of justice and the methods judges may ethically employ to discover truth. However, it is worth noting that Solomon almost certainly knew his command would never be carried out because the test would reveal the truth before any harm occurred. The case of the two mothers became the template for understanding Solomon's judicial wisdom, but it was only the beginning. As his reign progressed, he would face countless complex cases requiring discernment, and his reputation for just judgment would draw people from far and wide to seek his decisions. But wisdom in judgment was only one aspect of the gift God had given him. Solomon's wisdom would manifest in administration, diplomacy, architecture, literature, natural science, and theology. The young king was beginning to fulfill his divine potential in ways that would amaze the ancient world. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about biblical wisdom and how God provides supernatural ability to fulfill the callings he places on our lives. The next chapter of Solomon's story reveals how he channeled his wisdom into the greatest building project the ancient world had ever seen, a temple that would become the center of worship for generations and a symbol of God's presence among his people. Chapter 5. The Temple of Divine Glory. Solomon had been king for 4 years when he sent messengers to Hiram, king of Tyre, renewing the alliance his father David had established with that powerful maritime nation. The message Solomon sent was both diplomatic and deeply theological, explaining his intention to build a temple for the name of the Lord, his God. Solomon reminded Hiram that David, his father, had been unable to build such a temple because of the warfare waged against him on all sides, until the Lord put his enemies under his feet. But now, Solomon explained, the Lord his God had given him rest on every side, with no adversary or disaster. Therefore, Solomon intended to build a temple for the name of the Lord his God, just as the Lord had told David his father would happen. This message reveals Solomon's understanding that the temple was not his own idea or achievement, but the fulfillment of a divine plan established in the previous generation. David had wanted to build the temple himself, feeling uncomfortable that he lived in a palace of cedar while the Ark of God remained in a tent. But God had told David through the prophet Nathan that David would not build the temple because he was a man of war who had shed much blood. Instead, David's son, a man of peace whose name would mean peace, would build the house for God's name. Solomon's request to Hiram was specific. He needed cedars of Lebanon cut by Hiram's experienced woodsman, as the Israelites did not have the expertise in timber work that the Sidonians possessed. Solomon offered to pay whatever wages Hiram set for his men, and promised that his own workers would labor alongside Hiram's servants. The cedar of Lebanon was the most prized timber in the ancient world, known for its beauty, fragrance, and resistance to decay and insect. It was the only wood suitable for a temple that would stand for generations as a monument to God's glory. Hiram's response was enthusiastic. He praised the Lord for giving David a wise son to rule over such a great nation, and he agreed to supply all the cedar and pine logs Solomon needed. The arrangement they worked out was economically beneficial to both kingdoms. Hiram's men would cut the logs in Lebanon and float them as rafts by sea to wherever Solomon specified. There they would be separated, and Solomon's men would take them away. In return, Solomon would supply Hiram's royal household with food. The text specifies that Solomon gave Hiram 20,000 cors of wheat and 20,000 baths of pressed olive oil each year. This was more than a simple business transaction. It was a strategic alliance between two kingdoms, binding them together through mutual economic dependence and cooperative labor on a project of religious significance. Solomon was demonstrating diplomatic wisdom by turning a potential rival into a partner. Tyre controlled the Mediterranean coast and had superior naval technology and trading networks. Israel controlled important land trade routes and produced agricultural abundance. Together, they could both prosper in ways neither could achieve alone. Solomon conscripted laborers from all Israel, 30,000 men in total. He sent them to Lebanon in shifts, 10,000 per month, so that each man spent 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. This rotation system showed concern for the workers' well-being, allowing them to maintain their farms and families while still contributing to the national project. A man named Adoniram was in charge of this forced labor, a position that required enormous organizational skill to coordinate shifts, transportation, supplies, and productivity across such a large workforce. In addition to the Lebanese work crews, Solomon had 70,000 carriers and 80,000 stonecutters in the hills, plus 3,300 foremen who supervised the workers. These numbers are staggering, representing perhaps the largest construction project undertaken in the ancient Near East up to that time. The king gave orders to quarry large blocks of quality stone to provide a foundation for the temple using dressed stone. Solomon's builders and Hiram's builders, along with the Gebalites, cut and prepared the timber and stone for building the temple. The actual construction began in the 4th year of Solomon's reign, in the month of Ziv, which was the 2nd month of the Hebrew calendar. The text provides detailed measurements of the temple structure, and while these may seem tedious to modern readers, they were considered essential information in the ancient world, demonstrating the careful planning and sacred proportions of the building. The temple was 60 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. A cubit is approximately 18 inches, making the temple roughly 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet tall. These dimensions might seem modest compared to great cathedrals or modern megachurches, but several factors must be considered. First, the temple was not designed to hold large congregations. Most worship activities happened in the courtyards outside, with only priests entering the temple building itself. Second, the temple was densely decorated with gold, precious stones, and intricate carvings, making it far more valuable than its size would suggest. Third, in the ancient world, the symbolic and spiritual significance of a building mattered more than its physical dimensions. The portico at the front of the main hall of the temple extended 20 cubits across the width of the temple and projected 10 cubits from the front. Solomon made narrow clerestory windows in the temple and built structures against the temple walls, running around both the main hall and the inner sanctuary. He made side rooms all around, each 5 cubits high on the lowest floor, 6 cubits on the middle floor, and 7 cubits on the 3rd floor. He made offset ledges around the outside of the temple so that nothing would be inserted into the temple walls. One fascinating detail the text provides is that the temple was built using stone finished at the quarry, so that no hammer, chisel, or any other iron tool was heard at the temple site during its construction. This requirement served both practical and spiritual purposes. Practically, it reduced noise and chaos at the sacred site. Spiritually, it symbolized that the temple was being assembled according to a divine plan, rather than shaped by human tools at the building site. Each stone was cut to exact specifications elsewhere, then brought and fitted into its predetermined place. Solomon paneled the interior of the temple with cedar boards, covering the floors with planks of pine. The inner sanctuary he prepared within the temple to set the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord there. The inner sanctuary was 20 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 20 cubits high, forming a perfect cube. This Holy of Holies, the most sacred space in the temple, was overlaid with pure gold. The entire interior of the temple was covered with gold. No stone was visible anywhere inside. Even the altar that belonged to the inner sanctuary was overlaid with gold. In the inner sanctuary, Solomon made a pair of cherubim out of olive wood, each 10 cubits high. One wing of the first cherub was 5 cubits long, and the other wing 5 cubits, making 10 cubits from wing tip to wing tip. The second cherub also measured 10 cubits, for the 2 cherubim were identical in size and shape. These cherubim stood side by side in the inner sanctuary. Their wings spread so that one wing of each cherub touched one wall, while their other wings touched each other in the center of the room. The cherubim were overlaid with gold. Solomon also carved cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers on all the walls of both the inner and outer rooms of the temple, and he overlaid the floors of both rooms with gold. For the entrance to the inner sanctuary, he made doors of olive wood with 5-sided jambs, and on the 2 olive wood doors he carved cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers, and overlaid them with gold, hammering gold over the cherubim and palm trees. The amount of gold used in the temple was astronomical, representing a significant portion of the kingdom's wealth accumulated over David's reign through conquest and tribute. The main hall of the temple took 7 years to complete. When it was finished, it stood as a testament to Solomon's wisdom in organization, his diplomatic skill in securing materials and craftsmen, his wealth in funding such an elaborate project, and his devotion to honoring God with the very best his kingdom could offer. The dedication ceremony would come later, but already the temple was transforming Jerusalem from David's political capital into the religious center of the nation, the place where God's name would dwell and where sacrifices and prayers would be offered according to the covenant given through Moses. But even as the temple rose stone by stone and was overlaid with gold leaf by leaf, there were questions that troubled thoughtful observers. Could the God who created the heavens and the earth truly dwell in a house made by human hands? Did the infinite need a finite structure? These questions would be addressed during the dedication ceremony, but they pointed to a tension at the heart of temple theology. The temple was both necessary as a focal point for worship and as a fulfillment of God's instruction, and inadequate, since no building could contain the creator of the universe. Like and subscribe if you're learning biblical details you never knew before. The temple's completion set the stage for what many consider the golden age of Israel, a time of unprecedented peace, prosperity, and international influence. But Solomon's story was about to take a turn that would introduce new complexities and challenges to his reign. Chapter 6. The Queen's Journey and Hidden Knowledge. Solomon's fame spread far beyond Israel's borders, carried by merchants, diplomats, and travelers who returned to distant lands with stories of the wise king and his magnificent temple. Trade routes that crossed the ancient Near East buzzed with tales of Solomon's judgments, his proverbs, his understanding of the natural world, and the splendor of his court. These stories reached the ears of kings and queens in lands so far away that most Israelites had never even heard their names. Among those who heard the reports was a powerful woman who ruled a wealthy kingdom in what is now modern-day Yemen or Ethiopia, known as the Queen of Sheba. The text tells us that when the Queen of Sheba heard about Solomon's fame in connection with the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions. This queen was no ordinary ruler. Sheba was a center of the spice trade, a kingdom that controlled valuable trade routes and possessed enormous wealth from frankincense, myrrh, gold, and precious stones. For a reigning queen to leave her kingdom and undertake the arduous journey of over 1,000 miles across desert terrain demonstrated how intrigued she was by the reports of Solomon's wisdom. She arrived in Jerusalem with a very large caravan, carrying spices, large quantities of gold and precious stones. This was not a minor delegation, but a massive display of wealth designed to impress Solomon and demonstrate that she came as an equal, not a petitioner. Ancient Near Eastern diplomatic protocol required that visitors bring gifts proportional to their status, and the Queen of Sheba's caravan announced that she was a powerful monarch in her own right. When she met Solomon, she asked him all that was on her mind, all the questions she had prepared to test whether his reputation was genuine or exaggerated. The text does not record the specific questions she asked, which has led to centuries of speculation. What kind of questions would a queen travel over 1,000 miles to ask? Some Jewish traditions suggest they were riddles and puzzles designed to test intellectual quickness. Some Islamic traditions, which also tell stories of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, suggest they dealt with matters of theology and the nature of God. Some scholars propose they were political and diplomatic questions about governance and justice. Most likely, they were a combination of all these elements, touching on wisdom, theology, natural philosophy, and practical governance. Whatever the questions were, Solomon had answers for all of them. Nothing was too difficult for the king to explain to her. The Hebrew text emphasizes that there was nothing hidden from the king that he could not explain. This suggests that some of the questions dealt with secrets or mysteries, hidden knowledge that most people would not possess. Solomon's ability to answer demonstrated that his wisdom was not just clever thinking, but genuine understanding of profound truths. When the Queen of Sheba saw all the wisdom of Solomon and the palace he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his officials, the attending servants in their robes, his cupbearers, and the burnt offerings he made at the temple of the Lord, she was overwhelmed. The Hebrew phrase suggests she was breathless, as though the magnificence had literally taken her breath away. She said to the king that the report she heard in her own country about his achievements and wisdom was true, but she had not believed it until she came and saw with her own eyes. Indeed, she told Solomon, not even half was told to her. His wisdom and wealth had far exceeded the report she had heard. She pronounced his people happy and his officials blessed to stand continually before him and hear his wisdom. Then she offered a blessing that acknowledged the source of Solomon's gifts. Praise be to the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and placed you on the throne of Israel. Because of the Lord's eternal love for Israel, he has made you king to maintain justice and righteousness. This statement from a foreign queen is theologically significant. She recognized that Solomon's wisdom and position were not his own achievements but gifts from the God of Israel, and she connected his rule explicitly to justice and righteousness, the purposes for which God had established the monarchy. She gave Solomon 120 talents of gold, large quantities of spices, and precious stones. The text notes that never again were so many spices brought in as those the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. The exchange was not one-sided. Solomon gave the Queen of Sheba all she desired and asked for besides what he had given her out of his royal bounty. The phrase, all she desired, has led to considerable speculation in later traditions about the nature of the relationship between Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Ethiopian tradition claims that she bore Solomon a son named Menelik, who became the founder of the Ethiopian royal dynasty and supposedly brought the Ark of the Covenant to Ethiopia. While the biblical text does not support these claims, they demonstrate how the story of this royal meeting captured imaginations across cultures. What is clear from the biblical account is that this was a diplomatic triumph for Solomon. A powerful foreign queen had traveled an enormous distance specifically to verify his reputation, had been thoroughly impressed by what she found, had acknowledged the God of Israel, and had established friendly relations with his kingdom. This kind of international recognition elevated Israel's status among the nations and opened trade opportunities that would increase the kingdom's prosperity. The Queen of Sheba's visit also demonstrates an important aspect of Solomon's wisdom. He was not just knowledgeable about internal Israelite matters or Jewish law. His understanding was comprehensive, covering topics that would interest and impress a foreign monarch from a completely different culture. This breadth of knowledge, what we might today call being a Renaissance man, was part of what made Solomon's wisdom so remarkable. He could discuss theology with priests, nature with naturalists, governance with rulers, and trade with merchants, demonstrating expertise in every domain. Some scholars suggest that the Queen of Sheba's questions may have touched on occult knowledge, hidden wisdom that went beyond ordinary learning. The ancient world was filled with mystery traditions, secret teachings passed from master to student, and Solomon's reputation evidently extended into these areas. Later, Jewish and Christian traditions would associate Solomon with magical knowledge, the ability to control demons, and possession of supernatural secrets, though the biblical text itself is more restrained in its claims. What we can say with certainty is that Solomon's wisdom attracted international attention and respect. Kings and queens from distant lands sought his counsel and sent delegations to establish relationships with his kingdom. This diplomatic success was as much a part of his wise governance as his famous legal judgments. He had transformed Israel from an isolated hill country into a respected regional power whose king was sought out for his counsel. Comment below what questions you would ask Solomon if you had the chance. What mysteries or problems would you want his wisdom to address? The story of the Queen of Sheba's visit marks the high point of Solomon's international reputation, but it also foreshadows future complications. The text mentions that she gave him spices in quantities never equaled again, and shortly we will see how Solomon's appetite for the exotic, for foreign goods and foreign wives, would begin to lead him away from the exclusive devotion to the God of Israel that had been the foundation of his wisdom. Chapter 7. Treasures Beyond Measure. The Queen of Sheba's gifts were merely one stream flowing into a river of wealth that poured into Solomon's kingdom from every direction. The text of 1 Kings provides detailed accounts of the gold that came to Solomon each year, and the numbers are staggering by any standard. 666 talents of gold came to him annually, not including the revenues from merchants and traders and from all the Arabian kings and the governors of the territories. To put this in perspective, a talent was approximately 75 pounds, meaning Solomon received nearly 50,000 pounds of gold each year from regular tribute and taxes alone. This extraordinary wealth came from multiple sources. First, Solomon's kingdom controlled important trade routes between Africa, Asia, and Europe. Merchant caravans traveling from Egypt to Mesopotamia or from Arabia to the Mediterranean coast had to pass through Israelite territory, and Solomon taxed these commercial activities. Second, Solomon had established a sophisticated system of administrative districts, each governed by officials who were responsible for collecting taxes and providing supplies for the royal household 1 month per year. This system ensured steady revenue and distributed the burden across the kingdom. Third, Solomon engaged in royal trading ventures that generated enormous profits. He imported horses from Egypt and chariots from Clee, acting as a middleman who then sold them to the Hittite and Aramaean kings at a markup. The text specifies that a chariot imported from Egypt cost 600 shekels of silver and a horse 150 shekels. Solomon's merchants purchased these in bulk and resold them to northern kingdoms that did not have direct access to Egyptian markets. This kind of royal commerce was common in the ancient world, where kings were not just rulers but also the primary economic actors in international trade. Fourth, Solomon built a fleet of trading ships at Esion-Geber, which is near Elath on the shore of the Red Sea in the land of Edom. These ships, operated by Solomon's men working alongside Hiram's experienced sailors, sailed to distant lands and returned with gold, precious stones, and valuable timber. The text mentions that they sailed to Ophir and brought back over 16 tons of gold on a single voyage. The location of Ophir remains one of history's mysteries, with theories placing it in Arabia, Africa, or even India. but wherever it was clearly a source of extraordinary wealth. King Solomon made 200 large shields of hammered gold, using 600 shekels of gold on each shield. He also made 300 small shields of hammered gold, using 3 minas of gold on each. These shields were not practical weapons but ceremonial objects demonstrating the kingdom's wealth. Solomon placed them in the palace of the Forest of Lebanon, a building so named because it was constructed with 45 cedar pillars supporting cedar beams, creating a forest-like appearance inside. Solomon also made a great throne covered with ivory and overlaid with fine gold. The throne had 6 steps and its back had a rounded top. On both sides of the seat were armrests with a lion standing beside each of them. 12 lions stood on the 6 steps, one at either end of each step. Nothing like it had ever been made for any other kingdom. This throne became legendary in the ancient world as a symbol of Solomon's glory and the splendor of his court. All of King Solomon's goblets were gold, and all the household articles in the palace of the Forest of Lebanon were pure gold. Nothing was made of silver, because silver was considered of little value in Solomon's days. The king had a fleet of trading ships that sailed with Hiram's fleet. Once every 3 years, these ships returned carrying gold, silver and ivory, and apes and baboons. These exotic items demonstrated the reach of Solomon's commercial network and a luxury of his court. King Solomon was greater in riches and wisdom than all the other kings of the earth. The whole world sought audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom God had put in his heart. Year after year, everyone who came brought tribute, articles of silver and gold, robes, weapons and spices, and horses and mules. This continuous flow of diplomatic gifts added to the regular revenue from taxes and trade, creating a treasury of almost incomprehensible wealth. Solomon accumulated chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses, which he kept in the chariot cities and also with him in Jerusalem. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and cedar as plentiful as sycamore fig trees in the foothills. This poetic description emphasizes how the extraordinary had become ordinary in Solomon's kingdom. Materials that were precious and rare in other nations were abundant in Israel under Solomon's prosperous reign. But this enormous wealth raises important questions. Was such accumulation appropriate for the king of God's chosen people? The law of Moses, given centuries earlier, included specific restrictions on Israelite kings. Deuteronomy chapter 17 commanded that the king must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. The king must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. These 3 prohibitions, horses, wives, and wealth, were designed to prevent the king from becoming like pagan monarchs who relied on military might, political alliances through marriage, and economic power rather than on God. Solomon was clearly violating at least 2 of these 3 restrictions. His accumulation of horses and chariots directly contradicted the command not to acquire great numbers of horses. His accumulation of gold and silver violated the prohibition against amassing wealth. The text seems to present these accumulations neutrally as evidence of Solomon's greatness and God's blessing. But the careful reader who knows the Torah's restrictions would recognize warning signs. Prosperity was becoming excess, blessing was becoming potential curse, and success was creating conditions for future failure. The wealth also had social consequences. The magnificent buildings, the standing army, the royal court's luxury, the international trade operations, all of these required enormous labor and taxation. The 30,000 men conscripted to work in Lebanon, the 70,000 carriers, the 80,000 stonecutters, these represented a significant portion of the kingdom's workforce diverted from agriculture and family life to royal projects. The administrative districts established to supply the royal household 1 month per year meant each region bore a heavy burden of taxation in kind. Some scholars suggest that the seeds of the kingdom's later division were planted during Solomon's prosperous reign. The northern tribes, already somewhat resentful of Judah's dominance since the capital was in Jerusalem, bore much of the labor burden for projects that primarily glorified the king and beautified the capital. When Solomon's son Rehoboam later refused to lighten these burdens, the northern tribes would rebel and establish a separate kingdom. The prosperity of Solomon's reign, while genuine, came at costs that would only become fully apparent later. Nevertheless, the text presents Solomon's wealth as a fulfillment of God's promise. When Solomon asked for wisdom rather than riches, God promised to give him both. The extraordinary prosperity was evidence of divine blessing, confirmation that Solomon's priorities had been correct. The wealth enabled the construction of the temple, supported a court where wisdom could be cultivated, and elevated Israel's status among the nations. In the ancient world, a king's wealth was not personal luxury but a statement about his kingdom's power and his God's favor. The question that would haunt Solomon's later years was whether he had kept his priorities straight. Had wisdom remained his greatest treasure, or had the accumulation of wealth, power, and pleasure gradually displaced the humble request he had made at Gibeon? Could a man possess the world's greatest riches without being possessed by them? The next chapters of Solomon's story would reveal the dangers lurking beneath the golden surface of prosperity. Subscribe and share this video if you're gaining new insights into Solomon's story. What's coming next reveals the mysterious elements of his reign that have fascinated and troubled readers for thousands of years, the questions about supernatural power, and the price of seeking knowledge that goes beyond what God freely offers. Chapter 8: The Mysterious Ring of Power Beyond the Biblical Text. Layers of tradition and legend have accumulated around Solomon's name, particularly concerning his relationship with supernatural forces. These traditions, found in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic sources, speak of a mysterious ring that gave Solomon power over demons and spirits. While the Bible itself does not mention such a ring explicitly, certain passages hint at knowledge and abilities that seem to exceed normal human wisdom, leading later generations to speculate about the full extent of Solomon's supernatural authority. The most direct biblical reference to Solomon's extraordinary abilities is found in 1 Kings chapter 4, which states that God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight, and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the people of the East, and greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He spoke about plant life, from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of walls. He also spoke about animals and birds, reptiles and fish. This description suggests Solomon possessed encyclopedic knowledge of the natural world, what we would today call biology, botany, and zoology. But in the ancient worldview, understanding the natural world was not separate from understanding spiritual realities. The same wisdom that allowed Solomon to classify plants and animals would also give him insight into the invisible realm of spirits and powers. Ancient peoples believed that the natural and supernatural worlds were interconnected, that wisdom meant understanding both material and spiritual dimensions of reality. Jewish tradition, particularly as recorded in texts like the Testament of Solomon, elaborates extensively on Solomon's power over demons. According to these accounts, Solomon received a magical ring inscribed with the ineffable name of God, a ring that gave him authority to command demons and compel them to serve him. The Testament claims that Solomon used these enslaved demons as workers in the construction of the temple, forcing supernatural beings to cut stones, transport materials, and perform tasks beyond human ability. The text describes Solomon summoning demons one by one, interrogating them about their powers and weaknesses, and assigning them specific tasks. Islamic tradition also preserves detailed stories about Solomon's ring and his authority over jinn, supernatural beings made of smokeless fire. The Quran acknowledges Solomon as a prophet and mentions that God subjected the wind to his command and gave him authority over demons who built structures for him. Islamic commentaries elaborate that Solomon's ring bore the name of God and functioned as a seal of authority over all created beings. Stories tell of Solomon using this authority not just for construction projects, but also to punish wrongdoers, rescue victims, and maintain justice throughout his kingdom. But what should we make of these traditions? Are they preserving authentic historical memory of supernatural events, or are they legendary elaborations created centuries after Solomon's death to explain his remarkable achievements? The biblical text itself is remarkably restrained compared to the later traditions. It credits Solomon's wisdom to God's gift but does not explicitly describe him commanding demons or possessing magical objects. The temple construction is attributed to human workers, Israelite conscripts, and Phoenician craftsmen, with no mention of supernatural labor. However, some passages in Scripture do suggest that Solomon's knowledge extended into areas that made later generations uncomfortable. The book of Ecclesiastes, traditionally attributed to Solomon, contains reflections that sound almost skeptical, questioning the meaning and value of life in ways that seem dark and pessimistic. The Song of Solomon contains erotic poetry celebrating physical love with an intensity that has troubled some religious readers. And 1 Kings itself will later describe how Solomon's foreign wives turned his heart after other gods, suggesting he became involved in religious practices that included elements modern readers would consider occult. There is also the matter of Solomon's literary legacy. The Book of Proverbs contains profound moral and practical wisdom. The Song of Solomon explores human love and desire. Ecclesiastes wrestles with meaning and mortality. But ancient sources also attribute to Solomon texts on magic, demonology, and occult knowledge. The Testament of Solomon, though not considered canonical scripture, was widely read in ancient Christian communities and influenced medieval grimoires, books of magical procedures. Whether Solomon actually wrote such texts, or whether later magicians simply used his name to lend authority to their writings, remains debated. One theory suggests that Solomon's comprehensive study of the natural world led him into areas that ancient people would not have distinguished sharply from magic. If he studied plants and their properties, he would have investigated medicinal herbs, poisons, and plants with psychoactive effects. If he studied animals, he would have encountered beliefs about omens, divination from animal behavior, and creatures thought to have supernatural connections. If he sought to understand everything, he would inevitably have explored the supernatural beliefs of surrounding cultures, not necessarily to practice them, but to comprehend the full scope of human knowledge. Another possibility is that Solomon's God-given wisdom included genuine spiritual discernment, the ability to detect demonic influence and counter it through divine authority. This would not require a magical ring or occult practices, but would be an extension of the same spiritual gift that allowed him to perceive truth in difficult legal cases. Later generations, not understanding how spiritual authority works, might have assumed Solomon used magical techniques and created stories about rings and spells to explain abilities that were actually spiritual gifts. The danger in Solomon's pursuit of comprehensive knowledge was that understanding something is not the same as remaining separate from it. Solomon could study other nations' religions to comprehend them intellectually, while still maintaining exclusive devotion to the God of Israel. But knowledge creates familiarity. Familiarity reduces revulsion, and reduced revulsion opens the door to participation. This progression would become tragically clear in Solomon's later years, when intellectual curiosity about foreign gods became tolerance of their worship, which became personal participation in rituals that violated everything his father David had stood for. The ring, whether literal or metaphorical, represents the seductive belief that wisdom and knowledge are always good regardless of their source or use. Solomon may have believed that his God-given wisdom protected him from spiritual danger, that he could explore any knowledge without being corrupted by it. This is the temptation every intellectual faces, the pride of believing one's understanding provides immunity from the very dangers one is studying. Solomon would learn, as many have learned since, that some knowledge comes with costs that outweigh its benefits. The biblical text maintains a careful balance, celebrating Solomon's wisdom while also recording his failures. It does not indulge in the elaborate demonology of later traditions, but it also does not shy away from describing how Solomon's pursuit of knowledge and pleasure led him away from the exclusive devotion God required. The question of whether Solomon actually possessed a magical ring of power is less important than the question of whether his God-given wisdom remained sufficient for him, or whether he sought additional power and knowledge from sources God had forbidden. What seems clear is that Solomon's reputation for wisdom extended into areas that included what ancient people considered supernatural knowledge, whether this involved actual authority over demons, deep understanding of spiritual realities, or simply comprehensive knowledge that included study of occult beliefs practiced by other cultures. Solomon's name became associated with hidden wisdom and supernatural power. This association would influence religious and magical traditions for thousands of years, making Solomon a figure of fascination, not just for believers, but also for those seeking occult knowledge. Like this video if this exploration of Solomon's mysterious reputation is revealing aspects of his story you never encountered before. The next chapter delves deeper into the theological and practical implications of his wisdom and begins to trace how his greatest strength would become intertwined with his greatest weakness. Chapter 9. When angels serve a mortal king. The concept of a human being exercising authority over supernatural beings is both fascinating and troubling to modern readers. Yet this theme appears repeatedly throughout Scripture, not just in Solomon's story but in the broader biblical narrative. From the beginning, God gave humanity dominion of the creation, appointing human beings as stewards who would rule the earth under God's authority. This dominion was understood to include not just physical creation, but also authority over spiritual forces, though always derived from God and exercised in accordance with His will. Solomon's wisdom gave him insight into the spiritual realm that few humans have possessed. The text suggests he understood the workings of creation at levels that allowed him to speak authoritatively about every living thing. In the ancient worldview, such comprehensive understanding would necessarily include awareness of spiritual beings and their relationship to the material world. Angels and demons were not abstract theological concepts, but real entities that interacted with the physical realm in ways that wise people could perceive and understand. The biblical text provides hints of Solomon's spiritual authority without elaborating in the detailed way later traditions would. When the temple was being built, we are told that the stones were finished at the quarry, so that no hammer or tool was heard at the temple site. This unusual procedure suggests concern for maintaining the sacred character of the location, but it also creates practical questions. How are massive stones transported and fitted together with such precision that they required no on-site modification? Some traditions suggest supernatural assistance was involved, angels or even controlled demons providing strength and precision beyond human capability. During the temple dedication ceremony described in 1 Kings chapter 8, Solomon offered a prayer that reveals his understanding of spiritual realities. He acknowledged that even the highest heavens cannot contain God, much less the temple he had built. Yet he asked that God's eyes would be open toward the temple day and night, the place where God had said His name would dwell. This theology of God's name dwelling in the temple represented sophisticated thinking about divine presence. God was not contained in the building, but He had chosen to associate His name, His reputation and character with that location. When Solomon finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. The priests could not enter the temple because the glory of the Lord filled it. This visible manifestation of divine presence was witnessed by all the Israelites. And when they saw the fire coming down and the glory of the Lord above the temple, they knelt on the pavement with their faces to the ground, and they worshipped and gave thanks to the Lord. This was no subjective spiritual experience, but a public, physical event that validated Solomon's work and God's acceptance of the temple. This kind of dramatic divine manifestation suggests that Solomon operated with a level of spiritual authority that brought heaven and earth into closer contact. When he prayed, God answered visibly. When he built according to divine instructions, God's presence filled the structure. This was not magic or manipulation of spiritual forces, but cooperative relationship between a faithful servant and the God who had chosen him. Solomon's wisdom included understanding how to align his actions with God's will in ways that released divine power. Yet the line between proper spiritual authority and improper occult practice can be thin and easily crossed. The nations surrounding Israel practiced divination, sorcery, necromancy, and various forms of magic, all attempts to manipulate spiritual forces for human benefit. God had explicitly forbidden these practices to Israel, not because they were ineffective, but precisely because they worked by accessing spiritual power from sources other than God himself. The prohibition was not about preventing his people from experiencing supernatural reality, but about ensuring they accessed that reality only through relationship with him. Solomon's comprehensive study of wisdom potentially exposed him to knowledge of these forbidden practices. As he investigated the beliefs and wisdom of Egypt, the East, and other surrounding cultures, he would have encountered their magical traditions. Understanding these practices intellectually, in order to comprehend how other nations thought and to refute false beliefs, was legitimate. But there was constant danger that understanding would lead to experimentation, that curiosity would override obedience, that the pursuit of comprehensive knowledge would transgress the boundaries God had established. Later biblical books suggest this may have happened. The book of Ecclesiastes, attributed to Solomon, contains passages that sound almost atheistic, questioning whether human beings have any advantage over animals, whether death is truly different for the righteous and the wicked, whether there is any meaning to life at all. These passages are often interpreted as Solomon recording the emptiness he discovered when he pursued wisdom, pleasure, and accomplishment apart from God. But they might also reflect his exposure to philosophical and religious systems that had no place for the God of Israel, ideas that intrigued him even as they ultimately left him empty. The Testament of Solomon, though not biblical scripture, may preserve some authentic tradition when it describes Solomon becoming proud of his power over demons and gradually using them not just for temple construction, but for personal gratification and curiosity. According to this text, Solomon's eventual downfall began when he fell in love with a foreign woman who worshipped false gods and agreed to sacrifice to her deities to win her favor. The demons he had controlled then gained power over him, leading him into deeper idolatry. Whether this specific story is historical or legendary, it captures a spiritual truth. The gifts God gives us, including wisdom and spiritual authority, can become sources of pride that lead to our downfall. Solomon's wisdom was meant to help him govern justly and maintain Israel's covenant with God. If he began to see it as personal power rather than divine gift, as a tool for his own purposes rather than for God's glory, the very wisdom that should have protected him would become the path to his corruption. The biblical text will later make clear that Solomon did fall into idolatry, building high places for foreign gods and apparently participating in their worship. How could the wisest man who ever lived make such a foolish choice? The answer may be that wisdom without continued humility becomes arrogance. Knowledge without ongoing dependence on God becomes self-sufficiency, and spiritual authority without constant submission to God's lordship becomes dangerous pride that invites demonic influence rather than resisting it. Angels serve God, and they serve those whom God commands them to serve. If Solomon exercised authority over angels, it was only because God delegated that authority for specific purposes. The moment Solomon began to see such authority as his own power rather than God's gift, he would have lost the protection that came with humble dependence. This is why the biblical text emphasizes that Solomon's wisdom was from God, not naturally his own. It was a gift that required ongoing relationship with the giver, not a possession he could use independently. The question of whether Solomon literally commanded demons, or whether later tradition elaborated on his spiritual discernment, is ultimately less important than the theological point. Wisdom, knowledge, and even spiritual authority are dangerous gifts if they lead to pride and independence from God. Solomon's story illustrates both the heights human beings can reach when operating in God-given wisdom and the depth to which they can fall when that wisdom becomes disconnected from its divine source. Comment below your thoughts on spiritual authority and where the line is between proper discernment and dangerous occult involvement. This is not just an ancient question, but one every generation of believers must wrestle with as we seek to exercise spiritual gifts without crossing into practices God has forbidden. Solomon's example should make us both confident in the authority God gives us and cautious about the pride that can corrupt even the best gifts. Chapter 10. The seduction of forbidden knowledge. Solomon's quest for wisdom and knowledge was noble in its inception, but dangerous in its execution. The text tells us he spoke 3,000 proverbs and composed over 1,000 songs. He classified plants from the greatest cedar trees to the smallest hyssop growing in cracks in walls. He systematically studied animals, birds, reptiles, and fish, creating what amounted to an ancient encyclopedia of natural history. This intellectual curiosity was part of the wisdom God had given him, the ability to observe, understand, and explain the created order. But curiosity, like every human capacity, can be misdirected. There is a difference between the wisdom God freely offers and the forbidden knowledge he has placed off limits for our protection. In the Garden of Eden, God gave Adam and Eve access to every tree except one, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The prohibition was not arbitrary but protective. Some knowledge damages those who possess it, not because the information itself is inherently corrupting, but because human beings lack the moral capacity to handle certain realities without being destroyed by them. Solomon apparently believed his God-given wisdom protected him from the dangers other people faced when they ventured into forbidden territory. If God had made him wiser than any other human, surely he could safely explore areas that would destroy ordinary people. This logic seems reasonable, even humble in a way, trusting that God's gift was sufficient for any challenge. But it fatally misunderstood the nature of the prohibition. God had not forbidden certain practices because people lacked wisdom to handle them correctly. He had forbidden them because they intrinsically violated the exclusive relationship he demanded with his people. The nations around Israel practiced various forms of divination, attempting to discern hidden knowledge or predict the future through occult means. They consulted mediums and spiritists who claimed to communicate with the dead. They interpreted omens from animal livers, bird flights, and astronomical observations. They practiced magic and sorcery, attempting to manipulate spiritual forces to produce desired outcomes. They worshipped a host of gods and goddesses, each supposedly controlling different aspects of nature and human experience. And they incorporated ritual prostitution and even child sacrifice into their religious practices. God had commanded Israel to completely avoid these practices, not to even inquire about them. The command was clear and unambiguous. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not learn to imitate the detestable ways of the nations there. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices their son or daughter in the fire, who practices divination or sorcery, interprets omens, engages in witchcraft or casts spells, or who is a medium or spiritist or who consults the dead. Anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord. The prohibition covered not just doing these things, but even learning about them with the intention of imitation. Solomon's comprehensive study of wisdom from all nations potentially brought him into contact with these forbidden practices. Egyptian wisdom included magical texts and incantations. The wisdom of the East included astrological systems and divination techniques. When Solomon studied these systems, when he invited wise men from these cultures to share their knowledge, when he married women from nations that practiced these religions, he was exposing himself to ideas and practices God had forbidden Israel to pursue. The text indicates that Solomon's downfall was directly connected to his foreign wives. King Solomon loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter, including Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. These were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, "You must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods." Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. 700 wives and 300 concubines represents an extraordinary number, even for ancient monarchs who routinely married multiple women for political alliance purposes. Each of these marriages represented a diplomatic connection with another nation, bringing economic and military benefits to Solomon's kingdom. But they also brought religious and spiritual influences that God had explicitly warned against. Each wife would have brought her native deities and religious practices with her, expecting to continue worshipping the gods of her homeland even while living in Jerusalem. Solomon, in his wisdom, apparently saw no harm in allowing these women to worship their own gods. He probably considered it a matter of tolerance and respect for different cultures. His comprehensive knowledge included understanding of these various religious systems, and perhaps he believed that intellectual understanding had immunized him against their spiritual danger. He knew the theology of Israel's God was superior to the mythologies of these foreign deities. What harm could there be in permitting practices he knew to be spiritually inferior? But this calculation fatally underestimated the power of gradual influence and the human heart's capacity for self-deception. Tolerance of false worship around him slowly became curiosity about it, then respect for it as an alternative path, then participation in it to please his wives and maintain domestic harmony. The text states clearly that as Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David, his father, had been. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. These were not minor deities or harmless cultural variations. Ashtoreth, also called Astarte or Ishtar in different cultures, was a fertility goddess whose worship involved ritual prostitution. Worshippers would have sexual relations with temple prostitutes as a form of worship, believing this act would ensure agricultural fertility and human reproduction. Molech worship was even more horrific, involving child sacrifice. Worshippers would heat a bronze statue of the god until it glowed red, then place their children in its arms as offerings, with drums beating loudly to drown out the screams. That Solomon, the wise king who had built the temple of the Lord, could participate in such abominations seems almost incomprehensible. How could someone with such understanding of God's character and requirements violate them so completely? The answer lies in the gradual nature of spiritual decline. Solomon did not wake up one morning and decide to abandon the God of Israel for foreign deities. His fall was a progression of small compromises, each seeming minor and justifiable at the time, that accumulated into complete apostasy. First came intellectual curiosity about other religious systems, legitimate in itself. Then came marriage alliances with foreign women, politically advantageous and initially accompanied by the assumption that he would remain faithful to Israel's God. Then came tolerance of his wives' religious practices, a concession that seemed like cultural respect. Then came building high places and altars so his wives could worship, going beyond tolerance to active facilitation. Then came attendance at their religious ceremonies, initially perhaps as a political courtesy. Finally came participation in the rituals themselves, crossing the line into idolatry and practices that violated everything Solomon had once stood for. Each step seemed reasonable at the time, each compromise justified by circumstances, but the cumulative effect was catastrophic. The man who had received supernatural wisdom from God, who had built the temple and presided over its dedication, who had brought Israel to unprecedented prosperity and international influence, was now worshipping false gods and participating in practices that included sexual immorality and child sacrifice. His wisdom had not protected him. If anything, it had made his fall more dangerous because he could rationalize and justify every step of the descent. The Bible's inclusion of this tragic decline serves as a warning to every generation. Wisdom, knowledge, spiritual gifts, successful ministry, none of these provide immunity from spiritual failure. In fact, they can create a dangerous confidence that we are beyond the temptations that destroy ordinary people. Solomon apparently believed his wisdom made him strong enough to dabble in forbidden areas without being corrupted. He learned too late that God's prohibitions are not arbitrary restrictions for the weak, but protective boundaries for everyone, including the wise. The seduction of forbidden knowledge is that it promises enlightenment, power, and freedom from limitations. It whispers that those who are truly wise can safely explore what is forbidden to others. It suggests that knowledge itself is morally neutral and that only the weak are corrupted by what they know. But this philosophy ignores the reality that some knowledge corrupts the knower, that some doors once opened cannot be closed, and that God's wisdom sometimes consists precisely in choosing not to know what he has forbidden. If this deep exploration of Solomon's fall is giving you new understanding of how spiritual decline happens, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the remaining chapters. We're approaching the tragic climax of Solomon's story, where the consequences of his compromises will become impossible to ignore, and where God's judgment will finally fall on the king, who had once been more blessed than any other. Chapter 11. 700 Wives and a Divided Heart. The number itself is shocking. 700 wives of royal birth plus 300 concubines meant Solomon had 1,000 women in his harem. To modern readers, this seems not just immoral, but practically impossible. How could one man maintain relationships with 1,000 women? The answer is that these were not relationships in any meaningful sense, but political arrangements, diplomatic marriages, the sealed alliances with other kingdoms, and concubines who were essentially property rather than partners. In the ancient Near East, royal polygamy served political and economic functions. When a king married a princess from another nation, he was creating a formal alliance with her father's kingdom. The marriage represented a binding commitment between the two royal houses, more durable and personal than a mere treaty. If Solomon married daughters of 700 different rulers, he was establishing a vast network of international relationships that brought trade benefits, military alliances, and political stability. Each marriage represented another thread in a diplomatic web that made Israel central to the region's political structure. From a purely political perspective, Solomon's marriages were brilliant strategy. They transformed Israel from a relatively small hill country kingdom into a regional power connected by marriage to nations from Egypt to the Euphrates River. These alliances brought economic prosperity through expanded trade, military security through mutual defense arrangements, and cultural enrichment through exposure to diverse traditions and knowledge. The caravans carrying spices, gold, and precious stones to Jerusalem were often connected to kingdoms where Solomon had wives from their royal families, but God's law had explicitly prohibited this practice. The king, Moses had written, must not take many wives or his heart will be led astray. The prohibition was not based on sexual morality in the narrow sense, but on spiritual fidelity. God knew that foreign wives would bring foreign gods, and that cultural and religious influence would gradually erode Israel's exclusive devotion to the Lord. The command was clear, but Solomon apparently believed his wisdom allowed him to violate it safely. He could marry foreign princesses for political benefit while maintaining his own devotion to Israel's God. For years, this calculation seemed to work. The kingdom prospered, the temple stood as a monument to the God of Israel, and Solomon's wisdom remained legendary. But gradual spiritual erosion was occurring beneath the surface of success. The foreign wives naturally wanted to continue worshipping the deities of their homelands. They would have pleaded with Solomon to allow them this comfort so far from their native countries. He, in his wisdom and generosity, agreed. What harm could there be in letting them practice their own religions? He knew the truth about Israel's God and did not feel threatened by the false gods of other nations. So altars and high places were built in the hills surrounding Jerusalem, shrines where Solomon's wives could offer sacrifices to their various deities. The text specifically mentions that Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, on a hill east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. These were not minor shrines tucked away in private locations, but significant structures visible from the city. The smoke from their sacrifices would have been visible from the temple where sacrifices to the Lord were offered. The establishment of these shrines was already a terrible compromise, facilitating idolatry even if Solomon himself did not participate. But the text indicates that Solomon went further. He did the same for all his foreign wives who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. This suggests that Solomon actively built numerous shrines for various deities, creating a multi-religious landscape where the exclusive worship of the Lord was just one option among many. Jerusalem, which was supposed to be the city where God's name dwelt, had become a center of religious pluralism. Even this might have been rationalized as political necessity and cultural tolerance. But the text reveals that Solomon's involvement did not stop at building facilities for others. His heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely as David his father had done. The clear implication is that Solomon himself participated in worship of these foreign deities, crossing the line from tolerance to personal idolatry. How could this happen? How could the man who prayed the magnificent dedication prayer at the temple, who acknowledged that even the highest heavens could not contain God, who had experienced God's glory filling the sanctuary, how could he bow before idols of wood and stone and participate in rituals honoring deities that did not even exist? The answer lies in understanding how the human heart works and how gradual compromise operates. Solomon's foreign wives were not just political arrangements but real people who lived in his palace, who interacted with him daily, who pleaded their cases and influenced his thinking. The text says he held fast to them in love, suggesting that at least some of these marriages involved genuine emotional attachment. When a woman you love asks you to honor her beliefs, to participate in ceremonies that are important to her, to respect the religious tradition she grew up with, the pressure to comply is intense. Refusing seems intolerant, harsh, unloving. Solomon probably rationalized his participation in various ways. He might have told himself he was merely attending ceremonies without truly worshipping, that his presence was political courtesy rather than religious commitment. He might have adopted a philosophical perspective that all religions contain some truth and that the wise person can appreciate multiple traditions without being committed to any. He might have convinced himself that his devotion to the Lord was secure regardless of outward participation in other rituals. Each of these rationalizations contains enough truth to be plausible and enough falsehood to be spiritually fatal. There is also the factor of boredom and the search for novelty. Solomon had everything: wealth beyond measure, fame throughout the known world, hundreds of wives and concubines, access to the accumulated wisdom of multiple civilizations. What was left to experience? What could still stimulate someone who had exhausted ordinary pleasures? The forbidden has a powerful attraction precisely because it is forbidden. The rituals of foreign gods, especially those involving sexual elements or altered states of consciousness, might have offered experiences Solomon had not yet had, new sensations for a man who had tried everything else. The book of Ecclesiastes, traditionally attributed to Solomon's later years, reads like the reflections of a man who pursued every possible source of meaning and pleasure and found them all empty. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. This sounds like someone who has exhausted the catalogue of human experience and discovered that accumulation and pleasure do not produce the satisfaction they promise. Solomon's divided heart manifested in divided loyalties, and divided loyalties produced a divided kingdom. The text indicates that God was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although God had forbidden him to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. This double emphasis that God had appeared to Solomon twice and that Solomon had received explicit commands he chose to ignore underlines the magnitude of his sin. This was not ignorance or mistake, but deliberate rebellion against clearly known truth. The concept of a divided heart is theologically rich. Jesus would later teach that no one can serve two masters, that devotion to God requires wholehearted commitment, not partial allegiance. James would write that a double-minded man is unstable in all he does, that trying to maintain friendship with both God and the world makes a person useless for either. Solomon attempted to maintain devotion to the Lord while also accommodating worship of foreign deities, and the result was that his heart was fully devoted to neither. This is perhaps the most sobering aspect of Solomon's tragedy. He did not completely abandon the God of Israel. He continued to maintain the temple worship, to fund the sacrifices, to be publicly associated with the Lord. But his heart was divided, his devotion compromised by competing loyalties. And God judges not just our actions but our hearts, not just our public religious identity but the actual allegiance that controls our choices. A divided heart is, in God's accounting, not partially faithful but fundamentally unfaithful. Share this video if this analysis of how spiritual compromise works is giving you insight into your own life. Every believer faces pressures to divide their loyalty, to compromise their devotion, to participate in what God has forbidden while still maintaining a religious identity. Solomon's fall demonstrates that no amount of wisdom, no history of blessing, no position of religious leadership provides immunity from this danger. The only protection is wholehearted, undivided commitment to the Lord, maintained through constant vigilance and renewed surrender. Chapter 12. Altars to foreign gods. The hills surrounding Jerusalem began to change during Solomon's later reign. Where once there had been only the Temple Mount with its magnificent structure dedicated to the Lord, now multiple high places appeared on the surrounding ridges. Each was dedicated to a different deity. Each served a different group of worshippers from Solomon's international household. Smoke from their sacrifices rose to compete with the smoke from the temple altar, visible evidence that Jerusalem was no longer exclusively devoted to the God of Israel. The high place Solomon built for Chemosh was particularly offensive. Chemosh was the national god of Moab, and worship of this deity involved practices that violated multiple commandments. Archaeological evidence and ancient texts suggest that Chemosh worship, like that of Molech, sometimes included child sacrifice. Worshippers believed that offering their children, especially firstborn sons, to Chemosh would gain the god's favor and ensure military victory or agricultural prosperity. The practice was an abomination not just because it was idolatry, but because it was murder of the most innocent, sacrificing children to appease non-existent gods. That Solomon would build a shrine facilitating such worship is shocking enough. That he built it on a hill east of Jerusalem, in plain sight of the temple, demonstrates how completely his spiritual judgment had been compromised. The very location was a visual statement that worship of Chemosh was legitimate, an acceptable alternative to worship of the Lord. Anyone looking from the Temple Mount eastward would see the high place of Chemosh. Anyone worshipping Chemosh would look westward and see the temple. The message was religious pluralism, the idea that multiple paths to the divine were equally valid. The high place for Molech was equally offensive. Molech, also called Molech or Milcom, was worshipped by the Ammonites and sometimes by other nations as well. The central ritual of Molech worship was passing children through fire, a euphemism for burning them alive as offerings. Archaeological excavations have uncovered cemeteries near ancient Molech shrines containing the bones of infants and young children, physical evidence of this horrific practice. That Solomon would facilitate such worship reveals how far he had fallen from the devotion that had characterized his early reign. But Chemosh and Molech were not the only foreign deities honored in Solomon's Jerusalem. The text indicates he did the same for all his foreign wives, implying that multiple shrines to various gods dotted the landscape around the city. Ashtoreth of the Sidonians would have had her shrine, with rituals involving fertility rites and sacred prostitution. Various Hittite, Egyptian, and Edomite deities would have been represented. Jerusalem, the city chosen by God as the place where his name would dwell, had become a multi-faith center where every god was welcome. From a modern perspective that values religious tolerance and pluralism, Solomon's accommodation of diverse faiths might seem enlightened and progressive. He was allowing people to worship according to their own traditions, not forcing everyone to conform to a single religious system. This seems consistent with principles of religious freedom and cultural respect that modern Western societies value. But this perspective misses the fundamental theological issue that made Solomon's actions rebellion rather than tolerance. Israel's covenant with God was not based on ethnic identity or cultural preference, but on exclusive relationship with the one true God who had revealed himself to them. The Lord had not claimed to be one God among many, first among equals in a pantheon. He had revealed himself as the only God, the creator of heaven and earth, the one who had no rivals and who would tolerate no competitors. Worship of other gods was not just preference for a different religious tradition, it was betrayal of the relationship God had established with Israel. The first commandment given at Mount Sinai was explicit: "You shall have no other gods before me." The second was equally clear: "You shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven, above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below." You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. The word jealous here does not mean petty possessiveness, but passionate commitment to the exclusive relationship God had established with his people. He had chosen Israel, delivered them from Egypt, given them his law, and brought them into the promised land. In return, he demanded exclusive devotion. Solomon's facilitation of idol worship was not just personal sin, but national betrayal. As king, he represented the entire nation before God. His actions affected not just his own relationship with God, but Israel's covenant status. By building shrines to foreign gods and participating in their worship, Solomon was leading the entire nation into covenant violation. The impact extended far beyond his personal spiritual condition to affect the nation's standing before God and its future destiny. The text indicates that God's response was direct and severe. So the Lord said to Solomon, "Since this is your attitude and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem which I have chosen." This judgment contains several elements worth noting. First, God held Solomon personally accountable for violating the covenant, despite his wisdom and despite his previous devotion. Wisdom did not excuse disobedience. Second, the judgment would affect not just Solomon but his descendants. The kingdom would be torn away from his son. Third, there was mercy mixed with judgment. The division would not occur during Solomon's lifetime out of respect for David, and one tribe would remain under his son's rule. Fourth, Jerusalem itself received special consideration. God's choice of that city meant he would maintain a remnant kingdom there despite Solomon's failure. This judgment introduces one of the Bible's recurring themes, that the sins of leaders have consequences extending beyond themselves. Solomon's idolatry would result in civil war and permanent division of the kingdom after his death. The northern tribes would rebel against his son Rehoboam and establish a separate kingdom under Jeroboam, one of Solomon's officials. This division would weaken both kingdoms politically and militarily, making them vulnerable to foreign conquest and eventually leading to destruction and exile. All of this traced back to Solomon's failure to maintain exclusive devotion to the Lord. But the judgment also reveals God's character. Despite Solomon's terrible sin, God did not immediately destroy him or remove him from the throne. The division would come later, and even then it would be partial, with one tribe remaining under Davidic rule. This restraint was not because Solomon deserved mercy, but because of God's commitment to David and to Jerusalem, his own earlier choices that he would honor despite the failure of David's descendant. God's judgment was real but measured, severe but not absolute. The high places Solomon built would remain for generations, continuing to contaminate Israelite worship long after his death. Later reformer kings like Hezekiah and Josiah would have to tear them down as part of their religious reforms. The very stones Solomon placed would become stumbling blocks for future generations. This illustrates how sin has lasting consequences, how one person's unfaithfulness creates problems that persist long after they are gone. Solomon's compromise with idolatry infected Israel's worship for centuries, making pure devotion to God increasingly difficult to maintain. Comment below if you're beginning to see how relevant Solomon's story is to contemporary issues of religious pluralism, tolerance, and the question of whether exclusive truth claims are compatible with respect for other beliefs. These are not just ancient problems, but live issues in modern secular societies where commitment to any exclusive religious truth is often viewed as intolerant or bigoted. Solomon's example shows that tolerance of what God has forbidden is not wisdom but foolishness, not enlightenment but darkness, not progress but regression from divine truth. Chapter 13, the prophet's warning God did not leave Solomon without warning. Even as the king descended into idolatry and compromise, God sent prophets to call him back, to remind him of his covenant obligations and warn him of coming judgment. The most prominent of these prophets was Ahijah the Shilonite, who would deliver a dramatic prophecy that revealed the future division of the kingdom and identified the man who would lead the rebellion against Solomon's son. The biblical text does not record a direct prophetic confrontation between a prophet and Solomon, similar to Nathan's confrontation with David over his sin with Bathsheba. This absence is itself significant. When David sinned, he responded to prophetic rebuke with immediate repentance, acknowledging his sin and accepting God's judgment. Solomon, despite his wisdom, apparently did not respond the same way. His heart had become hardened by years of compromise, and the humility that had characterized his early reign had been replaced by pride and self-justification. But God was preparing Solomon's successor even while Solomon still reigned. Jeroboam, son of Nebat, was an Ephraimite from Zeradah, one of Solomon's officials in charge of the labor force of the tribes of Joseph. The text describes him as a man of standing, and Solomon recognized his abilities and put him in charge of important work. But Jeroboam was also destined to become Solomon's enemy and the leader of the rebellion that would divide the kingdom. One day when Jeroboam was leaving Jerusalem, the prophet Ahijah met him on the road wearing a new cloak. The two of them were alone in the country, and Ahijah took hold of the new cloak he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. This was not random destruction, but prophetic symbolism, a dramatic action that communicated God's message more powerfully than words alone could have done. Ahijah then spoke to Jeroboam, instructing him to take 10 pieces for himself, representing the 10 tribes that would follow him in rebellion against Solomon's house. The prophet delivered God's explanation for this coming division. "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. But for the sake of my servant David and the city of Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, he will have 1 tribe. I will do this because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Molech, the god of the Ammonites, and have not walked in obedience to me, nor done what is right in my eyes, nor kept my decrees and laws as David, Solomon's father, did." This prophetic word confirms several crucial points. First, the division was directly caused by Solomon's idolatry. Second, God remained committed to his promises to David, ensuring that 1 tribe would remain under Davidic rule. Third, Jerusalem maintained special status despite Solomon's sin. Fourth, David was the standard against which Solomon was measured, and Solomon had failed to maintain his father's devotion. Fifth, the judgment was already decided. The division would definitely occur, though not during Solomon's lifetime. Ahijah continued with a message directed to Jeroboam personally. "If you do what is right in my eyes and walk in obedience to me and keep my decrees and commands as David my servant did, I will be with you. I will build you a dynasty as enduring as the one I built for David and will give Israel to you. I will humble David's descendants because of this, but not forever." This was an extraordinary promise, offering Jeroboam the same kind of dynasty God had promised David, conditional on obedience. Tragically, as later biblical books would reveal, Jeroboam would fail this test, leading the northern tribes into even worse idolatry than Solomon had practiced. When Solomon heard about Ahijah's prophecy, he tried to kill Jeroboam. This response reveals how far Solomon had fallen from the wisdom and justice of his early reign. Rather than repenting of the sin that had caused God to promise the kingdom's division, Solomon tried to thwart God's plan by murdering the man God had chosen. This was not wisdom but foolishness, attempting to solve a spiritual problem with political violence. It was also futile, since God's plans cannot be prevented by human action. Jeroboam fled to Egypt, where he found protection with Pharaoh Shishak. He remained there until Solomon's death, waiting for the moment when God's prophecy would be fulfilled. This detail is historically significant because it shows that Egypt, once Solomon's ally through his marriage to Pharaoh's daughter, was now willing to shelter his enemy. International relationships were shifting, and Solomon's kingdom was becoming vulnerable in ways it had not been during his prosperous years. The presence of prophets in Israel served a crucial function. They spoke God's word to kings and people, reminding them of covenant obligations and warning them of consequences for disobedience. Prophets provided accountability, ensuring that even the most powerful king was subject to divine law. Solomon's attempt to kill Jeroboam rather than heed the prophetic warning demonstrated that he had stopped listening to God's voice, preferring to silence the messenger rather than repent of the sin the message addressed. This pattern of rejecting prophetic warning would recur throughout Israel's history. Kings who should have led the nation in covenant faithfulness instead led them into idolatry, and prophets who warned of coming judgment were persecuted or killed. The northern kingdom established by Jeroboam would never have a righteous king. All would be judged by the standard of Jeroboam son of Nebat, who caused Israel to sin. The southern kingdom would have occasional reformers like Hezekiah and Josiah, but overall the trajectory was downward, leading eventually to the Babylonian exile. Solomon's refusal to repent when confronted with prophetic warning reveals a troubling truth about human nature. Knowledge of sin does not automatically produce repentance. Understanding that we are wrong does not necessarily change our behavior. Solomon had more wisdom than any other human being, yet his wisdom did not save him from foolish choices. He knew he was violating God's law, yet he continued in idolatry. He heard prophetic warnings of coming judgment, yet he did not turn back. Wisdom without humble obedience is useless. The question this raises is what value wisdom has if it does not produce righteous behavior. What good is knowledge of right and wrong if we choose wrong despite that knowledge? This is not just Solomon's problem, but humanity's fundamental issue. Paul would later write about this in Romans chapter 7, describing how he knew what was right but found himself unable to do it, knowing what was wrong but doing it anyway. The solution, Paul concluded, was not more knowledge but transformation through the Spirit, power to actually live according to the truth we know. Solomon had received every possible advantage. He had supernatural wisdom from God. He had experienced visible manifestations of God's presence. He had the example of his father David's repentance to learn from. He had prophetic warnings to call him back. Yet none of these prevented his fall into idolatry. If the wisest man who ever lived could fail so completely, what hope do the rest of us have? The answer the Bible consistently gives is that our hope is not in human wisdom or willpower, but in God's grace, His power to transform hearts and enable obedience that we cannot produce on our own. If you're finding these insights valuable, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. The final 2 chapters explore Solomon's last years, the legacy he left, and the lessons his life teaches about wisdom, power, prosperity, and the danger of gradual spiritual compromise that seems manageable until it becomes catastrophic. Chapter 14. The kingdom begins to crack. Solomon's final years were marked by troubles that would have been unthinkable during the prosperous early decades of his reign. The text of 1 Kings indicates that God raised up adversaries against Solomon, men who caused military and political problems that eroded the kingdom's stability. These adversaries were not random misfortunes, but direct consequences of Solomon's spiritual failure, God's judgment beginning to manifest in practical ways even before the king's death. The first adversary was Hadad the Edomite from the royal family of Edomen. The text provides background explaining how Hadad became Solomon's enemy. Years earlier, when David conquered Edom, Joab, the commander of the army, had gone to bury the dead and had struck down every male in Edom. Joab and all Israel stayed there for 6 months until they had destroyed all the men in Edom. But Hadad, then a young boy, fled to Egypt with some Edomite officials. They went to Midian first, then to Paran, where other men joined them, and finally arrived in Egypt. Pharaoh was so pleased with Hadad that he gave him a sister of his own wife, Queen Tarpenes, in marriage. She bore him a son named Genubath, whom the queen brought up in the royal palace. Hadad grew to adulthood in Egypt, treated as a member of the royal family. When Hadad heard in Egypt that David and Joab were both dead, he asked Pharaoh to let him return to his country. Pharaoh questioned why he wanted to leave when he had everything in Egypt, but Hadad insisted on going home. Hadad became a source of trouble for Solomon, harassing Israel from Edom. The text does not provide details of specific conflicts, but the implication is that Edom, which had been subjugated under David and controlled during the early part of Solomon's reign, was now reasserting independence and causing military problems. This represented both a strategic loss, since Edom controlled important trade routes, and a sign of weakness, since subject nations were beginning to rebel. The second adversary was Rezon, son of Ionada, who had fled from his master, Hadadezer, king of Zobah. When David destroyed Zobah's army, Rezon gathered followers and became leader of a band of rebels. They went to Damascus, where they settled and took control. Rezon was Israel's adversary as long as Solomon lived, adding to the trouble caused by Hadad. He ruled in Aram and was hostile toward Israel. Damascus, which had been controlled by Israel, was now independent under a hostile king. This represented another strategic loss and demonstrated the erosion of Solomon's empire. These military problems were accompanied by internal dissension. The forced labor system Solomon had established to build the temple, his palace, and other projects had created resentment, especially among the northern tribes. While Judah and Benjamin were relatively content since the capital was in their territory and they benefited directly from its grandeur, the northern tribes bore much of the labor burden for projects that primarily glorified the king and beautified Jerusalem. The seeds of division that would split the kingdom after Solomon's death were already germinating during his final years. The text also mentions that Solomon's wealth, which had seemed unlimited during his prosperous years, began to strain under the weight of his enormous household and building projects, maintaining 700 wives and 300 concubines, supporting a large court, funding ongoing construction, and maintaining a standing army of chariots and horses required enormous resources. The trade networks that had brought such prosperity were disrupted by hostile neighbors. Tax burdens increased to fund the king's expenses, creating economic hardship that added to political resentment. But the most serious problem was spiritual. Solomon's heart had turned away from the Lord, and with it went the divine blessing that had made his reign so successful. The wisdom God had given him was still present intellectually, but it was no longer guided by devotion to God's purposes. Solomon could still think brilliantly, but his thinking was now directed toward maintaining his own power and pleasure rather than serving God and his people. Wisdom divorced from righteousness becomes cunning, using intellectual ability for selfish ends rather than just purposes. The book of Ecclesiastes, written during this period according to tradition, reflects the emptiness Solomon felt despite his achievements. Everything is meaningless. The book begins utterly meaningless. What do people gain from all their labors at which they toil under the sun? The pessimistic tone continues throughout, questioning the value of wisdom, work, pleasure, and achievement. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. This sounds like someone who has had everything and discovered that having everything is not enough. Solomon's reflections in Ecclesiastes reveal a man grappling with the futility of life lived for earthly purposes. He had pursued wisdom and found that increased knowledge brought increased pain. He had pursued pleasure and found it unsatisfying. He had accumulated wealth and discovered it was meaningless. He had achieved fame and realized reputation was empty. He had built magnificent structures and recognized they would outlast him, but not give his life meaning. Everything he had sought apart from God had proven hollow. Yet, even in Ecclesiastes' darkness, there are glimmers of truth pointing back to God. The conclusion of the book captures this. Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. This is the wisdom Solomon should have maintained throughout his life, the simple truth that life's meaning is found in fearing God and obeying him, not in accumulating wisdom, wealth, pleasure, or achievements. But this conclusion came too late to save Solomon from the consequences of his choices. The judgment God had pronounced through Ahijah would be carried out. The kingdom would be torn from his son's hand and divided. The glorious united kingdom that David had built and Solomon had brought to its peak would fracture into competing northern and southern kingdoms that would fight each other and eventually both fall to foreign conquerors. All of this traced back to Solomon's failure to maintain undivided devotion to the Lord. The tragedy of Solomon's final years is that they did not have to happen this way. At any point, Solomon could have repented, could have torn down the high places he had built, could have sent away his foreign wives, or at least stopped participating in their idolatrous worship. God's judgment might have been averted, or at least mitigated, if Solomon had turned back. But he did not. Pride, habit, the comfort of his lifestyle, attachment to his wives, intellectual justifications, all of these combined to keep him on the path of disobedience, even as he watched his kingdom begin to crumble around him. This pattern repeats throughout human history. People see the consequences of their sin beginning to manifest but continue in the behavior anyway, hoping things will somehow improve without requiring them to change. Leaders recognize that their choices are leading to disaster but refuse to alter course because doing so would require admitting they were wrong. The initial compromise seems small and manageable, but each successive compromise becomes easier, and before long the person is trapped in patterns of behavior they never intended but cannot seem to escape. Solomon's story stands as a warning to everyone, regardless of how wise, successful, or blessed they may be. No one is beyond the possibility of catastrophic spiritual failure. No amount of past devotion guarantees future faithfulness. No level of understanding provides immunity from sin's deception. The only protection is moment by moment, day by day humility that recognizes our absolute dependence on God and deliberately chooses obedience even when alternatives seem attractive. Share this video if Solomon's trajectory is helping you understand the importance of guarding your heart and maintaining undivided devotion to God. The final chapter examines Solomon's death, the immediate aftermath, and the lasting lessons his life teaches about wisdom, power, prosperity, and the spiritual dangers that accompany success. Chapter 15. The final years of a fallen King Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel for 40 years, matching the length of his father David's reign. The number 40 appears frequently in Scripture, often representing a complete period or generation. Moses spent 40 years in Egypt, 40 years in Midian, and 40 years leading Israel through the wilderness. Israel was ruled by judges for periods of 40 years. David reigned 40 years. Now Solomon had completed his 40-year reign, and with his death would come the fulfillment of the prophetic warnings he had received. The text provides no details of Solomon's final days. We are not told whether he was sick or simply died of old age. We do not know if he expressed any regret for his idolatry or maintained his compromise to the end. The biblical account moves directly from noting his adversaries to recording his death. Then Solomon rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David, his father, and Rehoboam his son succeeded him as king. This terse summary stands in stark contrast to the detailed accounts of his wisdom, building projects, and wealth earlier in the narrative. The absence of detail about Solomon's death is itself significant. David's death was described with considerable attention, including his final instructions to Solomon, and the statement that he had died at a good old age, having enjoyed long life, wealth, and honor. Solomon's death receives no such favorable summary. There is no mention of dying in peace or being mourned by the nation. The text simply states that he died and was buried, and his son took over. This understated ending reflects the spiritual failure that marked Solomon's final years. Rehoboam, Solomon's son who would inherit the throne, proved unwise despite being raised in the most privileged circumstances imaginable. When the northern tribes came to him at Shechem requesting that he reduce the heavy labor and taxation burdens Solomon had imposed, Rehoboam consulted his advisors. The elders who had served Solomon counseled him to agree to the people's request, to be a servant to them and speak kind words, and they would serve him loyally forever. But Rehoboam rejected this advice and instead consulted the young men he had grown up with. These younger advisors told him to respond harshly, to tell the people that his little finger was thicker than his father's waist, that if Solomon had laid heavy burdens on them, he would make those burdens even heavier, that if Solomon had scourged them with whips, he would scourge them with scorpions. Rehoboam foolishly followed this advice. speaking harshly to the people who had come with a reasonable request. The result was immediate rebellion. "What share do we have in David?" the northern tribes declared. "We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, Israel. Look after your own house, David." The kingdom divided exactly as Ahijah had prophesied. 10 tribes followed Jeroboam and established the northern kingdom of Israel, with its capital eventually at Samaria. Only Judah and Benjamin remained under Rehoboam's rule, forming the southern kingdom of Judah with its capital at Jerusalem. The united kingdom that David had built and Solomon had brought to its peak of glory lasted only through these 2 reigns. From this point forward, there would be 2 Hebrew kingdoms, often in conflict with each other, both weaker than the United Kingdom had been. The division was not just political but spiritual. Jeroboam, fearing that if his people continued going to Jerusalem to worship at the temple, they would eventually want to reunite with the Davidic kingdom, established alternative worship centers at Bethel and Dan. He made golden calves and told the people these were the gods who had brought them out of Egypt. He appointed priests from all sorts of people who were not Levites. He instituted festivals on dates of his own choosing. This religious innovation, designed to secure political independence, led the northern kingdom into idolatry far worse than Solomon's compromise. Both kingdoms would struggle with idolatry throughout their histories. The northern kingdom would never have a righteous king. Every one of its rulers would be judged by the standard of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who caused Israel to sin. The southern kingdom would have occasional reformers like Hezekiah and Josiah, who tried to restore pure worship, but overall the trajectory was downward. Eventually, the northern kingdom would fall to Assyria in 722 BC, its population deported and replaced with foreign peoples. The southern kingdom would survive another century and a half before falling to Babylon in 586 BC, when Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed and the people carried into exile. All of this tragedy traced back in part to Solomon's spiritual compromise. His idolatry had infected the nation's worship, demonstrating that deviation from God's commands was acceptable even for the king. His heavy taxation and forced labor had created resentment that erupted in rebellion as soon as his strong hand was removed. His accumulation of wealth and glory had come at the expense of his people's well-being. The wisdom that should have been used to bless the nation had been redirected towards self-glorification and personal pleasure. Yet Solomon's legacy was not entirely negative. The temple he built stood for nearly 4 centuries, serving as the center of worship for generations. The Psalms and wisdom literature attributed to him preserved truths that would benefit people for thousands of years. The proverbs he collected provided practical guidance for living wisely. Even Ecclesiastes, with its pessimistic tone, preserved important truths about the emptiness of life lived apart from God. The international relationships he established brought Israel to a peak of prosperity and influence it had never known before and would never experience again. Solomon's life illustrates both the potential and the danger inherent in great gifts. Wisdom is a tremendous blessing that can produce justice, prosperity, and understanding, but wisdom without continued humility and obedience becomes pride and ultimately foolishness. Wealth is a tool that can be used to bless others and build great works. But wealth pursued as an end in itself becomes an idol that enslaves rather than serves. Power can be used to protect the weak and establish justice. But power without accountability becomes tyranny that oppresses rather than protects. The question Solomon's life poses to every generation is whether it is possible to have wisdom, wealth, and power without being corrupted by them. Can human beings handle success without it destroying them? Solomon's answer, purchased through bitter experience and reflected in Ecclesiastes, is that worldly success without devotion to God is meaningless and ultimately destructive. The only way to handle blessing without being ruined by it is to maintain moment-by-moment dependence on God, recognizing that every gift comes from Him and must be used for His purposes rather than our own. For believers today, Solomon's story provides both encouragement and warning. Encouragement, because God gives gifts generously to those who ask in humility, as He did when Solomon requested wisdom at Gibeon. warning, because even the greatest gifts do not protect us from spiritual failure if we allow pride, compromise, and divided loyalties to take root in our hearts. The same wisdom that could have kept Solomon on the right path became useless when he stopped applying it to his own life, when he began making exceptions for himself and rationalizing choices he knew violated God's commands. Perhaps the most important lesson from Solomon's life is the danger of gradual compromise. He did not wake up one morning and decide to abandon God and worship idols. His fall was a slow process of small decisions, each seemingly justified at the time, that accumulated into complete apostasy. The first foreign marriage seemed politically necessary. Allowing those wives to worship their own gods seemed like cultural respect. Building shrines for them seemed like loving accommodation. Attending their ceremonies seemed like marital courtesy. Participating in their rituals seemed like a way to understand them better. Before Solomon realized what was happening, he was deeply involved in worship of the very deities God had forbidden. This pattern of gradual compromise is not unique to Solomon, but represents the most common way believers fall into serious sin. Dramatic sudden falls into obvious evil are relatively rare. Far more common is the slow drift, the incremental compromise, the small exception that becomes a pattern, the justification that becomes a lifestyle. We tell ourselves that we are strong enough to handle situations that others might find dangerous. We convince ourselves that the rules that apply to ordinary people do not apply to us because of our knowledge, maturity, or special circumstances. We gradually redefine what is acceptable, moving boundaries little by little until what once would have shocked us now seems normal. The only defense against this gradual drift is constant vigilance, regular examination of our hearts and choices against God's word, honest accountability with other believers who will speak truth to us, and humble dependence on God's strength rather than confidence in our own wisdom or willpower. Solomon had supernatural wisdom but lost sight of these basics. If the wisest man who ever lived could fall, none of us can assume we are safe based on our knowledge, experience, or past faithfulness. If this comprehensive exploration of Solomon's life has given you new insights into biblical wisdom and the dangers of spiritual compromise, please like this video, share it with others who might benefit, and subscribe to this channel for more deep biblical studies. Solomon's story is recorded in Scripture, not just as history, but as instruction, a case study in both the blessings God pours out on those who seek Him and the tragic consequences of divided loyalty and gradual drift from devotion. The king who began his reign kneeling humbly before God, asking only for wisdom to serve his people well, ended his reign with his kingdom crumbling around him, the consequence of choices that seemed wise in his own eyes but violated God's clear commands. May his example teach us to seek wisdom while maintaining the humility that recognizes wisdom's limitations, to enjoy God's blessings while remembering that the giver is infinitely more important than the gifts, and to guard our hearts with constant vigilance, because even the strongest can fall if they cease to depend moment by moment on God's grace and guidance.